What do you think of when you hear the word soda? More often than not, it is Coke, right? It has been almost 140 years since Coke was released, and it is now sold in more than 200 countries in the world. From birthday parties to any kind of celebration and even some indigenous ceremonies, you will see bottles of Coke around. You will never see a ritual or a ceremony without bottles of Coke. Coca Cola is also a known name among remote tribes in Africa. Let's just say when I said that many people in the world have made Coke a part of their lives, I was not exaggerating. Because of how well it has been able to make a name for itself, it is also Warren Buffett's one of the most loved stocks. But did you know that Coca-Cola is secretly dying? Take a look at this stock chart. Since 1998, it has grown by a measly 38%. That amounts to an annual return of 1.7%. Yep, you heard that right. Coca-Cola has returned less than T-bills. So what has happened to Coca-Cola after more than a century of continuous growth and success? Coca-Cola was first invented by John Pemberton in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1886. And if you have often heard about Coke containing cocaine, well, it is true. The first recipe of the drink did contain cocaine, but in the form of an extract of the cocoa leaf. Frank Robinson, the company's accountant, named the drink Coca Cola, citing that the two C's would look good in the advertisement. Asa Candler, who began to acquire the company after the death of John Pemberton in 1888, finalized the purchase of the company in 1892, and the expansion of the company as the global brand that it is known as today started. By 1895, Coca-Cola was sold nationwide. The company has always heavily focused on advising its products. By 1911, the company's advertising budget had surpassed $1 million. In 1919, the company was sold to Ernest Woodruff's Trust Company of Georgia. With its rigorous marketing and expansion, Coca-Cola is now a global brand. Over 2.2 billion servings of Coca-Cola beverages are consumed every day. But there seems to be a problem. It is still one of the well-known brands of today, but its growth has been stagnant. Let's just say it is not growing exactly how you'd expect a company of its caliber to grow, especially if you look at its biggest competitor, PepsiCo. Coca-Cola generated over $43 billion in revenue in 2022, compared to PepsiCo's $86 billion. PepsiCo saw its revenue grow by 14% in 2022, while Coca-Cola saw its revenue grow by just 5% in 2022. Now, as for their stock prices, since their dot-com peak, Coca-Cola has grown 52%, which does not sound too bad until you factor in the inflation. And of course, if you compare it with that of Pepsi. During the same period, Pepsi grew by 339%. When you look at Pepsi's growth over the years, it feels like Pepsi beating Coca-Cola in its own game is inevitable. But one thing is for sure, Coca-Cola has more brand value because it has been able to penetrate the market worldwide. No matter how remote or developed the place is, people will recognize Coca-Cola as a brand anywhere, while Pepsi has not been able to achieve that yet. So what is the reason behind Coca-Cola's stagnation? When you usually see companies being stagnant, many factors are at play that cause the stagnation, but not with Coca-Cola. In the case of Coca-Cola, there seems to be only one factor that accelerated its growth when the company reached its peak in the 70s and 80s, and its decline after the 90s. That one factor is actually a person, Roberto Goizueta. He is not as famous as most CEOs, as he did not run a tech company that brought some revolution in the world. But he was the man behind Coca-Cola's global success. Usually, the success of a company heavily relies on the person running it, and that person has to be someone who truly knows the ins and outs of the company. In this case, Roberto was a perfect fit. He was someone who had worked for the company all his life. He worked for Coca-Cola in his home country, but sadly had to flee to the USA with his family. But even then, he had a pocket change of $40 and his job at Coca-Cola with him. All his professional life was spent at Coca-Cola. He saw the company's growth throughout the years and was genuinely interested in the expansion and growth of the company rather than just filling his pockets. To give you some context about how much he contributed to the company, from 1981 when he was appointed as the CEO of the company until 1997 when he died, he was able to increase the market value of Coca-Cola from $4 billion to $145 billion. That is an increase of 3,500%. This is remarkable in so many ways, but especially because the years leading to Roberto being the CEO had seen almost no market growth for Coca Cola. So what did Roberto do to the company to bring such remarkable growth? First and foremost, Roberto highly believed in changing the company from within. He completely transformed the culture at Coca Cola by being an example himself. He was always on time, and if not 15 minutes early. He believed in the power of incentive and saw it as a superpower. The company had a very conservative and risk-aversion stance, and Roberto completely changed that. He was all for taking risks, and under him the company started to expand and diversify. In his show of how serious he was about diversification as well as risk-taking, he purchased Columbia Pictures for $750 million just 1 year into his tenure. What was his motive for acquiring an entertainment company, you might wonder? Of course, it was to generate profit through this acquisition, but there was another one as well: advertisement. In just 3 years, Columbia was Coca-Cola's second most successful enterprise. It brought about 14% of their total operating income. It was a win-win for the company. They were making movies and earning profits and also advertising their products in Hollywood. This helped them acquire market share, and they got to sell Columbia Pictures to Sony for $3.4 billion. Roberto started to spend a lot of money on international expansion. He spent $30 million to acquire a stake in a company Philippines bottler. This was a big deal for a company that was super conservative and did not do any sporadic spending. It was also his decision to expand to Eastern Europe as soon as the Berlin Wall fell. This was risky considering Pepsi had most of the market share and the economic situation was not stable. But this massive bet paid off, and Coca Cola was dominating the market. Another one of his massive bets was switching from sugar to corn syrup, which was a cost reduction tactic as the corn syrup was 40% less. Along with this, it was also during his tenure that Diet Coke was launched, which turned out to be the company's one of the most successful products ever. Coke seemed to be doing amazing till 1998. So what happened to the company after that? Why such stagnation? Remember earlier when I told you that its success was because of Roberto? So is this stagnation? Roberto was a visionary. He liked taking risks and going in untested waters. With his death in 1997, the company immediately went back to its original conservative roots, which meant less risk-taking as well as diversifying and focusing more on their core products. This does not sound too bad until you look at the increase of competitors in the market. The competitors were coming out with new interesting flavors and sometimes even cost less. The consumers started having a lot of options to choose from. Their biggest competitor, Pepsi, started to diversify and started selling food products as well. While this was going on, Coke was not willing to take any risk. As a matter of fact, in 2020, Coca-Cola announced that it was saying goodbye to 200 brands. That accounted for half of the company's portfolio. Their aversion to risk clearly shows from not being willing to diversify in other markets to killing almost half of their products. Along with this, in the late 2000s, Coke decided to give up ownership of its bottling plants to increase its profit margins. And well, that does not seem to be working too well. Another reason for the decline of revenue for Coca-Cola is the sugar tax imposed by governments all around the world. By now, we have established that Coca-Cola is risk-averse and also refuses to diversify in other sectors. Various research into sugary drinks started to show their impact on people's health. People themselves became conscious about drinking them. But things went bad for companies when the government started to impose sugar taxes to decrease the consumption of these drinks. Taxes mean the price of the product becomes high, which means less consumption. Countries like Denmark, Finland, Hungary, France, and the UK are among some of the countries that impose the sugar tax. Research has shown that the tax has decreased soda consumption. Now, this is bad for a company like Coca-Cola, which relies heavily on its beverages for revenue. Along with this, the pandemic did not help. If the company thought that people were getting more health conscious before, they were not prepared to see what would happen during and after the pandemic. Coca-Cola saw a decline of 11.41% in their revenue in 2020. The pandemic taught people the importance of their health, and the number of people consuming sugary drinks is decreasing day by day. The increase in competitors and the vast amount of choices that consumers have now is also a risk factor for Coca-Cola. Since the pandemic, the revenue of Coca-Cola has started to gradually increase, but it is still yet to surpass its highest revenue of $48 billion, which it earned more than a decade ago, or achieve any significant growth. For now, Coca Cola still remains the market's favorite brand for soft drinks, and this is because of the extensive expansion of Roberto. Since Roberto's passing, the company has not been able to achieve that level of growth and success, mainly because of its conservative ways. If the company is unable to change its way and be more open to risks, its competitors, especially the biggest one, Pepsi, beating it seems like an inevitability.